During its imperial era, the Empire of Japan committed countless war crimes and crimes against humanity in various nations of Asia and the Pacific, especially during the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War. These incidents have been referred to as the Asian Holocaust. Most of these crimes occurred during the first part of the Showa era, under the reign of Hirohito. The Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy were responsible for a series of war crimes that resulted in millions of deaths. These crimes ranged from slavery, sexual abuse, and massacres to human experimentation, famine, and forced labor, all committed directly or tolerated by the Japanese government and military. Evidence of these crimes, including verbal testimonies and written records such as diaries and war logs, was provided by Japanese veterans. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service participated in chemical and biological attacks against civilians during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, in violation of international agreements Japan had previously signed, including the Hague Conventions, which prohibited the use of poisonous weapons in war. Since the 1950s, numerous high-ranking Japanese government officials have issued apologies for the war crimes. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan acknowledged the country's role in causing tremendous damage and suffering during World War II, particularly the massacre and rape of civilians in Nanking. However, the topic remains controversial, with some members of the Japanese government, including former Prime Ministers Junichiro Koizumi and Shinzo Abe, paying homage at the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors all Japanese war dead, including convicted Class A war criminals. In addition, some Japanese history textbooks make only brief references to the war crimes, and certain members of the Liberal Democratic Party have denied some of the atrocities, such as the government's involvement in the kidnapping of women to serve as comfort women. Get ready, because today you will see all the atrocities that Japan committed during the first half of the last century. The Japanese military culture played a significant role during Japan's imperialist period, especially before and during World War II. For previous centuries, Japanese samurai were taught to obey their lords strictly and to show unwavering courage in battle. After the Meiji Restoration and the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, military loyalty was directed toward the emperor. During the so-called imperial period, at the end of the 19th century, Japan actively sought to expand its empire, following the example of other world powers like other imperialist nations. Japanese popular culture became increasingly nationalist from the late 19th century to the 20th century. This nationalism was partly driven by the adoption of Shinto as the official religion in 1890, which was integrated into the educational system. Shinto considered the emperor a divine figure, descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, thus justifying absolute obedience to the emperor and his representatives. Victory in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95 elevated Japan to the status of an important military power. However, the country did not sign the Geneva Convention until the end of World War II, although an imperial proclamation in 1894 required Japanese soldiers to respect international laws. During this conflict, Japanese forces released 1,790 Chinese prisoners who promised not to fight against Japan again after the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. All 79,367 prisoners of the Russian Empire were released and compensated for their work in accordance with the Hague Convention. The behavior of Japanese military personnel during World War I was considered as humane as that of other countries involved in the conflict. Due to the immense scale of suffering inflicted by the Japanese army during the 1930s and 1940s, they are frequently compared with the military forces of Nazi Germany during the period 1933 to 1945. Much of the controversy surrounding Japan's role in World War II revolves around the mortality rates of prisoners of war and civilians under Japanese occupation. Historian Chalmers Johnson wrote that it may not make sense to try to determine which of the two Axis aggressors in World War II, Germany or Japan, was more brutal to the people they victimized. The Germans killed 6 million Jews and 20 million Soviet citizens. The Japanese killed around 30 million Filipinos, Malays, Vietnamese, Cambodians, Indonesians and Burmese, and at least 23 million ethnic Chinese. Both nations plundered the countries they conquered on a monumental scale, although the Japanese plundered more and for a longer period than the Nazis. Both enslaved millions and exploited them as forced laborers, and in the case of the Japanese, as sex workers for frontline troops. If you were a prisoner of war, British, American, Australian, New Zealander or Canadian in Nazi hands, you had a 4% chance of dying before the end of the war. Comparatively, the mortality rate for Allied prisoners of war in Japanese hands was nearly 30%. The mortality rate for Chinese prisoners of war was much higher because under a directive ratified on August 5, 1937 by Emperor Hirohito, restrictions of international law regarding the treatment of those prisoners were removed. Only 56 Chinese prisoners of war were released after Japan's surrender. In the Pacific and Asian theaters, Allied soldiers faced cruel disregard for civilized norms, similar to the treatment directed at Japanese soldiers. This inadequate treatment extended to prisoners of war, among other matters. Kingston, referring to this phenomenon, highlighted the observations of documentarians Jonathan Lewis and Ben Still, who argued that the perception that the war was characterized solely by Japanese brutality was being questioned by a growing body of evidence about atrocities committed by the Allies. More than comparing which side was worse, the real question was to understand whether they shared more similarities than previously imagined. During World War II, special Japanese military units carried out horrific experiments on civilians and prisoners of war in China. Among them, the most infamous was Unit 731. In these inhuman experiments, victims were subjected to amputations and vivisection without anesthesia and were also used to test biological weapons and other cruel experiments. Anesthesia was deliberately avoided because it was believed that its use could interfere with experimental results. In some cases, even animal blood was injected into the bodies of the victims. One of the most shocking cases of human experimentation occurred in Japan itself after the crash of a B-39 bomber of the United States Army Air Forces in Kyushu on May 5, 1945. 9 of the 12 crew members survived. The commander was sent to Tokyo for interrogation, while the other survivors were taken to Kyushu University in Fukuoka, where they were subjected to vivisection or killed. On March 11, 1948, 30 people, including several doctors, were tried for war crimes, although charges of cannibalism were dismissed. 23 individuals were found guilty of vivisection and/or illegal extraction of body parts. 5 were sentenced to death, 4 to life imprisonment, and the rest to lesser sentences. However, in 1950, General Douglas MacArthur, then military governor of Japan, commuted all death sentences and significantly reduced prison sentences. All those convicted in connection with vivisection at the university were released in 1958. Historical records indicate that Emperor Hirohito authorized the use of chemical weapons in China through specific orders. During the Battle of Wuhan from August to October 1938, the Emperor allowed the use of toxic gas on 375 separate occasions, violating international conventions and League of Nations resolutions. This act violated Article 23 of the Hague Conventions, Article 5 of the Treaty on the Use of Submarines and Poisonous Gases in War, and a League of Nations resolution condemning the use of poisonous gas by Japan. Deaths caused by famine in countries occupied by the Japanese are considered war crimes by many, with millions of civilians in Southeast Asia, especially in Vietnam and Indonesia, dying during a preventable famine between 1944 and 1945 due to the diversion of resources to Japanese troops. It was reported that the Imperial Japanese forces widely used torture on prisoners of war, generally with the goal of quickly extracting information. Tortured prisoners were often subsequently executed. One Shintaro, a former officer of the Imperial Japanese Army who served in China, declared that torture was considered necessary to obtain information, often followed by executions to prevent the discovery of the methods used. This reflected a dehumanizing view of enemies who were considered inferior and without rights. This dehumanization was sustained by the belief in the superiority of the Japanese race. Many Allied aviators captured by the Japanese on land or at sea were executed according to official Japanese policy. During the Battle of Midway in June 1942, 3 American aviators who were shot down and fell into the sea were spotted and captured by Japanese warships. After brief interrogations, 2 aviators were killed, their bodies tied to 5-liter kerosene drums filled with water and thrown from the destroyer Makigumo. The third was killed and his body thrown into the sea from the Arashi. The enemy aviator law contributed to the death of hundreds of Allied aviators during the Pacific War. It is estimated that 132 Allied aviators shot down during bombings over Japan were summarily executed after brief mock trials. Japanese military personnel deliberately killed 33 American aviators in Fukuoka, including 15 who were decapitated shortly after the Japanese government expressed its intention to surrender on August 15, 1945. Crowds of civilians also killed several Allied aviators before Japanese military personnel arrived to take the aviators into custody. Another 94 aviators died from other causes while in Japanese custody, including 52 who were killed when deliberately abandoned in a prison during the Tokyo bombing from May 24 to 25, 1945. Comfort women or women of relief is a euphemism used to refer to women who were forced into prostitution and sexual slavery in Japanese military brothels during World War II. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 200,000 women were recruited, although there is still disagreement about the exact figures. Correspondence from the Imperial Japanese Army shows that the purpose of establishing comfort stations was to prevent acts of rape committed by military personnel and thus avoid the emergence of hostility among populations in occupied areas. Given the well-organized and open nature of prostitution in Japan, the need for organized prostitution to serve the Japanese armed forces was seen as logical. In addition to supposedly preventing rape and the transmission of venereal diseases, the comfort stations were to serve as entertainment for soldiers and minimize the risk of espionage. However, the comfort stations did not solve the first 2 problems. According to Japanese historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi, these stations helped worsen them. Yoshimi stated that the Imperial Japanese Army feared that the latent discontent of soldiers could explode in the form of mutiny or rebellion, which is why they were provided women. Hospital ships are painted white with large red crosses to show that they are not combat vessels, but vessels transporting wounded personnel and medical staff. Here is a list of some of the hospital ships that were attacked by the Japanese during World War II. Shortly after the war, the Allies accused 25 individuals as Class A war criminals and 5,700 individuals as Class B or Class C war criminals. Of these, 984 were initially sentenced to death, 920 were actually executed, 475 received life imprisonment, 944 received various prison sentences, 1,018 were acquitted, and 279 were not convicted or not tried. This total included 178 ethnic Taiwanese and 148 ethnic Koreans. The Class A charges were all tried by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, also known as the Tokyo Trials. Other tribunals were established in various places in Asia and the Pacific. If you feel this video brought you value in any way, please subscribe to the channel. FASVIM Series. See you soon.